did. Right.
Glad you got that. Welcome back to Ask an Addiction Specialist. I'm happy to be here with you. I'm Dr. Bob Weathers, and I'm with my friend here,
Odie Martinez.
Odie Martinez. Very good to have you with me, Odie. Thank you.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah, great. Really happy for you all to join us today. By way of introduction, let me just say this. I'm a professor of clinical psychology here locally at California Southern University. I say locally, it's a little bit of a misnomer because we're an online university, and we have students all over the globe, actually. My specialty and what I focus on there is chairing doctoral dissertations. So these are students that are getting doctorates in clinical psychology, and at least half the students whose dissertations I'm chairing are studying addiction and recovery. And so it dovetails very well with the focus of our program of looking at addiction and recovery in depth. The second thing that I do is that I lead groups and also do staff training for Beginnings Treatment Centers. They're one of our sponsors for Ask an Addiction Specialist each week. And each week that I come here, I come from leading a men's group. And so I'm always fresh with experiences and conversations from Beginnings. And so this is a gratitude to Beginnings. I want to thank our producer in the studio, or actually our co-producers. One of them sitting right next to you, Odie, you've met. Austin Armstrong is manning all manner of technology as we're speaking, and Austin is a stable anchor through all of our shows. And so I want to thank Austin for all of your work. Just want to give a little bit of a context for today's conversation. Last week we had guests from the American Pharmacists Association, and they presented on what pharmacists are doing across the nation in terms of educating the public, particularly in light of the current opioid epidemic. Really appreciated their offering time to us and bringing their expertise, and really was just inspired by what they're doing. So I want to recommend, if you missed that show, to go back and look it up in our archives. And while I'm on that point, let me mention that you can archive, or you can view our archived videos in a number of different places. You can go to YouTube, Ask an Addiction Specialist, and they're all housed there. You can also go to beginningstreatmentcenters.com and look up podcasts, and they're all housed there as well, as along with other resources. And so there's multiple ways to review this. And today also you can access our show through the Facebook group, Ask an Addiction Specialist. So lots of options. You can also dialogue with us today live. And we have a guest who just said hello. Hello, Angela. I'm glad you're able to join us. That's wonderful. I know that Angela's traveling this weekend, so it's all the more meaningful that she's able to join us today. You're in the spirit of our dear friend Angela, you're welcome to share comments or questions as we go along. We'll have an exercise later today. I've shared this with Odie earlier, that will really invite your reflections and really encourage you to share, if you want to, with us in real time. And you can do that through the chat function on the Facebook group, also in YouTube. So there's multiple ways to communicate to us, and Austin will be the moderator. He'll let us know when you share something. So thank you very much for joining us. Very happy for you to be here. Before we dive into today's topic, the title is The Two Faces of Shame. I want to say a few words. Over the last 6 months or so, we've covered a lot of different topics, but they've kind of hovered and centered around a psychological perspective on addiction and recovery. And there's been a lot of conversation about the impact of shame and stigma on both active addiction as well as early recovery. And we've received a lot of feedback. There have been a lot of interactions here at Ask Addiction Specialist. Also, I've been able to give a number of presentations to different university groups, as well as different professional organizations, such as the American Pharmacists Association. And I've been able to kind of hone this material and also make it more concise. And my wish today, starting today, for the next number of weeks, is to create kind of bite-sized introductions to topics centering around this idea of unshaming. That is to say that if shame, and we'll talk more about all of this today, if shame is a problem in terms of it being part of what triggers addiction, and also triggers relapse, and is also central to being addressed if recovery is to be sustained and successful, I'd like to create a series of podcast presentations that you can review almost in terms of a home study course if you want to. So I'll be giving an exercise today. I'll actually provide a number of exercises that we won't pause long enough during our presentation for you to take 5, 10, or 15 minutes to respond, but you have access to this video as well as those at previous. But from these henceforth, I'll be interspersing our presentations with exercises that on your own, that's what I mean by home study, you can review the material in the videos as well as do the exercises. And what we'll do is we'll begin to build up kind of brick by brick I think a very skillful means for dealing with one of the central impediments to recovery, which is shame. So welcome to the honed, streamlined home study course of Unshaming, sponsored by Ask an Addiction Specialist. Again, let me mention that I want to invite you to feel free to submit questions as we go along. And here we go. To start with, let's just discuss right out of the starting gate that shame is understood as the most stressful human emotion. And let me just plot why that's important, is that since the number one trigger for relapse to addiction is stress, it's important that we find ways to manage stress. In fact, that was the topic of today's group that I led with the men at Beginnings Treatment Center. These are men who by definition are all in early recovery. And I wrote on the board, Stress Management 101. Here we are. And we spent the entire hour and a half group together addressing techniques and strategies for managing stress. And so to start with then, stress is the number one trigger for relapse. It's incumbent upon us, for those of us that are in recovery, for those of us that work with those who are in recovery, as well as those of us who have loved ones in recovery, that we find ways to support effective management of stress. Now, if stress is the number one trigger for relapse, and shame is the most stressful human emotion, then it stands to reason that it would be time well spent to be spent addressing shame. By most stressful emotion, I'll say a word about that, and I'm going to give you an exercise right now. Say a word about what I mean by most stressful. The way that biologists look at stress is they don't ask Odie or Bob, are you stressed out? They'll actually do a chemical analysis of our bloodstream, of our neurotransmitters, et cetera, of our hormone levels, and examine our stress just purely biologically, purely in a laboratory kind of way. There are two stress hormones that are associated with studies on shame, studies on how you evaluate how major the stress is. Those two stress hormones, one we know of, most of us know of adrenaline, and the second one is cortisol. And the studies that I'm talking about looked at 200 studies, in fact, of what kicks up our cortisol level, our stress hormone level the highest, and it was stress. It was shame. It was shame that kicked it up the highest. I'm reminded of a client that I saw years ago, a nurse who said something that strikes me as very true. She says, Bob, none of us can barbecue in our own adrenaline, at least for very long. Yeah. And you might as well add to that cortisol. And it's the relevance then to addiction of any kind. You know, Odie, we've talked, and we will, I'm sure today, talk about substance addiction, which I bring from my own experience being in recovery, and you talk about behavioral addiction, which you bring from your own experience in being in recovery, which I really appreciate. And so we're bringing addiction, whether it's to alcohol and other drugs or to behaviors. In both cases, many times, in fact, when I ask for a show of hands in the groups I lead, how many of you have used or relapsed to addiction owing to stress? Virtually everyone will raise their hand, which is back to this nurse's comment. None of us can tolerate being in a highly anxious, which is to say elevated cortisol, elevated adrenaline. We cannot tolerate to be in that state for long,
Right.
or we will self-medicate. And we can self-medicate by literally using drugs and medications, or we can self-medicate by various behaviors. And we'll talk about all of this more as we go along. But that gets us at least in the field of why it is that we would want to talk about shame today, and why it seems so important or so central to recovery. Question for all of our audience. I want everybody to pause for just a second. I really would advocate that you have a journal, a folder of blank paper, a spiral notebook, whatever you have, a tablet that you use online. I would really advocate for that in this course, because there'll be many exercises through the next several weeks that will be utilizing written material. I want to ask that all of us take a moment to just pause for a second and write down, what is the definition that comes to your mind? What's the definition that is familiar to you of shame? How would you define shame? I'm going to give a few seconds for you to pause about that. And then Odie and I are going to reflect on that together. So, Bob, Odie, and all the rest of us, how, in your own words, do you define shame? I'll get to a more technical definition, the way that psychology defines shame, as well as the way that these research studies that I just discussed define shame. But before I do that, let's have a conversation, Odie. So when you think of shame, what comes to your mind? What's the definition that comes to your mind?
The definition for me that comes to mind, and I've shared before in previous podcasts, is just wanting to hide and go inside my shell, like a turtle, you know.
Yeah.
And somebody, this is just an example, somebody saying something to me in a negative light, and me feeling like that's who I am. You know, not necessarily, oh, that's just their opinion, but that's who I am.
Yeah.
Because somebody that I care about put that label.
Yeah,
That's
good. Yeah.
my definition.
Yeah. My guess is your definition resonates for a lot of our viewers today. And each one of us will have a slightly different way of putting it, slightly different shading, but I think that Odie's cut right to the heart of it there. Is that one thing that it's interesting today in today's group, we were talking about stress, and I said, how do you all think of stress? And one of the members of the group said, I don't think of stress. I don't think of stress as something you think about. That was a great response, and I think it's implied in what you said, is that we can talk about shame, we can define it, we can use words to define it, but look at what you started with by saying, it makes me want to crawl in my hole. It makes me want to crawl into my shell like a turtle. I feel like that's really close to it. Is that shame is more of an embodied feeling that we have, and it's a response that it's undeniable.
Right. Yeah.
But it's not so easily put into words. I think you did a good job putting it into words. But it's like it's almost like it's more like a verb than an adjective. It's like this is what it makes me want to do.
Yeah. Before it wasn't really easy to word it that way for me. Before, I was asked, so how does it feel? And I'd just be like, I don't know. I don't know how it feels. I don't know. I can't tell you.
Yeah. We did an exercise today in the group that I think is relevant here to what you just said, Odie. And we did it in a different way than I've done before, is I introduced a mindfulness exercise at the beginning of this group. And as I mentioned earlier, it was an hour-and-a-half group. And I did a mindfulness exercise that we broke it into little bits, and we stretched it across much of the group. And what I did is I would just, basically something as simple as just focusing on our breath, and then I would do that for 2 or 3 minutes with the group, asking for individuals to do that. And then I'd say, how's it going? And we talk about that for a few minutes.
Right.
Some people had more facility with that than others, but all of us found that challenging. Something as simple as being able to focus my attention for just a few moments on my breath sounds so easy, doesn't it?
Right.
But it's really kind of difficult, And as we went along the way, what we did is we kind of expanded it. Like I said, we stretched it across the group, but we expanded it to include beginning to notice more subtle sensations than just our breath. So, for example, we talked about what would it be like to notice what it's like to sit in a chair and actually feel the weight of your body in a chair. Now, my guess is that you and I aren't sitting here thinking, oh, this is exactly what my body feels like sitting in the chair.
Right.
It tends to be background for us rather than foreground. But this exercise was meant to bring it to the foreground. And we continued on with that to include things like, what would it be like to notice, Bob and Odie, what your temperature is in your body, across your body? And so we did that, kind of just like locating, noticing that it's not the same across my body. There's certain parts of my body that are cooler in a given moment than others. And it got even subtler than that. We got into, can you locate, is it possible to locate your heartbeat in your chest without putting your hand on your chest? Who does that? Well, if you have too much time on your hands, that's what we do. That's what we did today. But what came of it, in fact, it was the next exercise that we did. I said, can you focus your attention just on your digestive tract right now, your stomach area, and notice, are you full? Are you hungry? Maybe you have indigestion, etc. Just focus some attention there. And what was interesting, the conversation that came of that, and it came right after we did that exercise, is that a few different people in the group noted that, I'm noticing stuff I never paying attention to. And in fact, I'm stressed out right now, and I notice it in my gut area, and I rarely am aware of it. And so then one individual shared, I get stressed out at work, and when I come home from work, it actually takes me a couple of hours to realize I've been stressed out at work. In other words, stress becomes background. It's almost like invisible.
Yeah.
Well, I think the same thing with shame, is that these things that we're talking about are not necessarily obvious to us. And I think especially as men, that we're less inclined to pay attention to feelings sometimes in terms of the way that we're raised than women are, and especially vulnerable feelings like shame. The last thing I want to share with you is that right now I want to crawl into a shell.
Right.
That seems like a very unmanly thing to do. And so I know, being raised as a guy and you as a guy, that we've been socialized to be tough and not vulnerable. And so especially to be able to notice feelings, much less to name them, is difficult to do. Yeah. So we start off by locating shame as something that's slippery, that's tricky to get a hold of, and that it's more of a feeling than a concept. I want to shift and talk about shame from a conceptual perspective, but we'll tie it back into behavior. In fact, we'll do further exercises. The next slide suggests this, is that the studies that have been done on high cortisol break down shame into two categories. One is it represents a threat to social acceptance, very much tied into what Odie shared.
Right.
Odie said, I feel like I'm being criticized for something I am, and I want to crawl into a hole. That would be a threat to, am I going to lose? Are you going to reject me? Are you going to judge me?
Yeah.
And so that definitely is a significant part of shame, is the threat to you liking me, you accepting me, you not judging me. And then there's a second part, there's a second threat, and that threat is to self-esteem. And what I want to talk about in just a moment is how related those two things are. But when I say a threat to self-esteem, that would be, if I use Odie's example, that would be somebody making a judgment about you as who you are, and that you go away from that doubting yourself. That'd be an example of it's gotten under your skin. That's the term that we use, where it's gotten under your skin. Now you're reflecting on it, and now you're not feeling so good about yourself. You're doubting your own worth, let's say, and that would be the kind of the inner version of what happened in the outer. You have a thought?
Yeah, I was thinking that's pretty much thinking to yourself. Correct me if I'm wrong, but like maybe going away from a situation where something like that happened, and then saying to yourself, no, that can't be right, that can't be right, they're wrong, and then slowly, like you said, thinking about it and saying, well, this happened before, so maybe they have a point.
Yeah.
Is that what you're
Yeah, that's good. No, that's really good.
Okay.
That's really good. So you might even go away from a situation and say, no, that's their mistake. They don't really see me. That's like a distorted view.
Right.
But given time to ruminate on it, and like you said, to reflect on the facts of the situation, it's possible that we'd be won over to that position, which would be a position of where now it's no longer that person or those individuals judging me. It's me judging me.
Right.
I'm just a person who, whatever comes after that. And in the context of shame, it's never complimentary.
Right.
So what we're talking about, and it's really based in your definition that you just shared, Odie, is that shame is very centrally a social emotion. Mm-hmm. It's very much affected in relationship to others. And a way for us to understand how it's a social emotion is to talk about evolutionary psychology for a minute. Evolutionary psychologists look at psychological
all right, ladies and gentlemen,
such as our
we are
thoughts and our
live
feelings
back
and our
on the
behaviors,
Sober Grind
and they look at them
podcast.
in terms
Right.
of one
It is our
criterion,
pleasure
and one
to
criterion
be with you
only.
here, as always, today.
From a
Again, my
completely
name is
biological
Austin Armstrong. I'm
perspective,
joined
and we're
by
certainly
my
a lot
ever
more
so
than just
special
biological
co-host,
beings.
Ted.
We are that.
And we have
But we're
the
also
lovely
psychological,
Annie
social,
with
and
us today.
spiritual beings.
And today for
But
you,
just
we
strictly,
have
if we
a
just
very
take all that away and
special
look at
guest.
ourselves only
His
from a
name is
psychological,
Leonard
only from a biological perspective, our central motivation is to get our genes into the next generation. Mm-hmm. That's how an evolutionary biologist talks about what motivates your behavior or my behavior. Mm-hmm. I realize it's not very poetic. It's not very inspiring. It's certainly not very romantic. But it's a way to it provides a lens or a grid through which to interpret human behavior from one perspective, and there's value in that, I believe, as long as we keep it in the context of other possible motivations too. Okay. I want to mention, while I'm talking about evolutionary psychology, that one of the key figures in terms of summarizing this is Robert Wright, just like the Wright brothers with the W. And I'm currently taking a course online from Robert Wright at Princeton, and he's one of those who's done a lot of work on this. His book that came out that is the best introduction that I know of to evolutionary psychology is simply called The Moral Animal. And what he gets at there is this kind of strange thing is that you and I are both animals from a biological perspective, but we also have moralities, unless we're just less than animals. And it brings together this idea of being animals and being moral at the same time. And I think Robert Wright does a fantastic job of unpacking that. The current course I'm taking and his most recent book examines mindfulness and meditation animal practices, which we talk a lot about here. Related to addiction and recovery. He talks about those from an evolutionary perspective in a way that's really quite insightful and revealing. I want to pause for just a second because I see out of the corner of my eye that somebody's got a comment on the screen, and it's right behind a pillar, so I'm going to go back and forth until I can read it, okay? Okay, here we go. We're good. It helps to understand how shame is part of a deeper drive for acceptance, which we talk a lot about, even though it is so detrimental. That's a very astute comment. He talks about those from an understand how shame is part of a deeper drive for acceptance, even though it is so detrimental. It's funny that you would say that. I'll continue in just a second. Is that from an evolutionary perspective, in fact, we're going to talk more about that, shame serves great value from an evolutionary perspective, as long as we don't get stuck in it, and we so oftentimes do get stuck in it. Enough so that in the context of our podcast series here, we've been using the term shame in a very specific way, talking about it as being toxic. Even though we'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. Let me continue with the comments. It also helps to hear the biology of shame tied to stress, and then as a trigger for relapse. Good. I'm glad for that connection. So it really helps to understand. It's just very practical to me to understand that enough said that in the context of our podcast, my recovery will be a direct reflection of my learning how to successfully manage stress. And then I begin to line up what's stressful. I'll oftentimes ask groups, Odie, what do you find stressful? People will report out this and that. What do you find stressful? And then as a trigger for relapse. Good. I'm glad for that evolutionary perspective. So it really helps to
The first thing that came to my mind is being late to
my recovery will be
or really everywhere.
Perfect.
It's very stressful.
And I share that with you. I grew up with a fastidiously timely mother, so very aware of time. And so to be late, or to have other people be late, can be very stressful. And so in the context of recovery, it's no more impractical than that. How am I going to manage this time thing? I've got to figure out some way to manage that. And I'll tell you, I'll self-dispose for myself, and you're welcome to, is that I have to manage this. And so what I'll oftentimes do is that I'll leave early for events, so that I don't have to be stressed out by being late, because being late is one of those stressors. If I'm really serious about reducing stress in my life, I look for any area that I can possibly, any place I have wiggle room, I'll apply myself to it. And I'll tell you a stressor that came up to me, for me, comes up often as we're asking groups, came up for me, and I can still remember I was in 5th grade. I was 11, and I still remember this. I didn't have the word stress in my vocabulary. In fact, I didn't have the word for this experience of really serious sex change, except I knew that it sucked. And it was, I can remember playing one day with my cars and my army men and so on out in the front yard, and I guess I did it too long because it went into a place that felt really, really bad, and I thought, what is this feeling? And I don't know how I came to discover what the words for that were. In fact, it's too long ago. But I do know that feeling was boredom. Except I typically wasn't bored that much as a kid. I'm typically not that bored as an adult. But when I do get bored, I don't like how it feels. And people will say, Dr. Bob, I thought of something that's stressful for me, boredom, but boredom's not stressful, is it? And I go, heck yes, it's stressful. Heck yes. In fact, if we could do an analysis that little Bobby's cortisol levels at age 11 out playing out in front of the house getting bored, my guess is they began to spike. I really did not like that feeling. And so there's a whole range of things from being late to boredom to interpersonal. Oftentimes I'll say what's stressful, and somebody will just say relationships. And because we're talking about psychology in an evolutionary sense, and we're talking about a social emotion, I want to talk about one of the ways that relationships can be stressful, which is around this dynamic of social acceptance. And we'll say more about that. So there was another comment on that boredom. I didn't quite finish that reading. Oftentimes I'll say what's stressful. Somebody will just say relationships. I love the comments. I kind of meander today. So it helps to understand how shame is part of a deeper drive for acceptance, even though it is so difficult. I want to talk about one of the ways that that's good. I think that's true. Which is part of the dynamic drive. It also helps to hear, we'll say, biology of shame tied to stress and then as a trigger for relapse. Next, shame usually feels so personal and isolating. It's very interesting observation because I said that shame is a social emotion. I kind of meander today. But it oftentimes, it helps to understand how shame is part of a deeper. It oftentimes is isolating, so it's paradoxical, isn't it? This so-called social emotion, which is something about being judged by others, makes me want to isolate from others. You can see the logic of that. It doesn't feel so social at those moments. It actually feels kind of antisocial. Yeah. So yeah, it is very painful, very personal, very private oftentimes, and can also be very isolating. So hearing these things makes it less personal and part of a human experience. This person says, thank you. Well, thank you for what you shared. I think one of the things, I'll come to this in the second to last slide today, is that when Odie and I talk, and I appreciate what you share here, Odie, when you and I talk, one of the reasons I'm wanting to redo this material is we're doing it together.
Yeah.
Because I've done this material alone, and I did it earlier on a year ago, and it was in isolation. and you and I share now, and that's part of the value for me of going back through this material. Absolutely. And it really is to get this out, to share it. And there's a way that you share, Odie, openly and transparently that is disarming. And I really appreciate it because I'd like all of us to feel disarmed with this. Yeah. And secrecy only feeds it. It only feeds and nourishes shame. So if we can find a way. Basically, what we want to do is starve shame, if I can say that. Yeah. I heard this image recently. I hope it's not too noxious. It was like you have to starve the stray cat. And they were talking about addiction. Is that it's like a stray cat that wants to come and pester you, but if you don't keep feeding it, eventually at least it will go away if it doesn't starve. So I want to be humane here. To know what the Humane Society coming, but at least we want the stray cat, especially if it has rabies. And I think that addiction has rabies. We want it to get far away, and definitely shame has rabies.
It reminds me of a workshop I went to for. What was it for, actually? I think like internet addiction, along with the ending was with porn addiction as well. And the speaker said something very interesting after his presentation when I went up to talk to him. And he said something similar to what you just said.
Is that right? Starve the stray cat?
Not the stray cat. He said, how did he say it? He said, starve the beast. He said, starve the beast, don't feed it.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Which,
I know from a psychological perspective that what was it? Don't feed it.
Starve the beast.
Don't feed it. Don't feed it. Is that we talk in learning theory in psychology, we talk about if you want to extinguish a response, don't feed it. The term that we use is don't reinforce it.
Right.
It's really this idea of don't feed it. And so, I sat today in the group today, and there was a gentleman to the left who had 30 days of sobriety, and I looked at him and I said, that is so wonderful. I said, every day that you starve the beast, I didn't use that analogy, but I could have, every day of sobriety is a day that the brain recovers and gets stronger. And he nodded and agreed. He's really beginning to feel changes in his life, and it's just a matter of starving the beast, not feeding it. And each day that he doesn't feed the addiction is a day in the direction of increased, actually he was talking about this, increased joy in his life.
Yeah.
He said he was amazed to experience joy without being altered chemically. And so, so that's the track that we're on. So, okay, so we're going to take an evolutionary psychological perspective for just a moment, and then we're going to have an exercise. How would a threat to social acceptance, from an evolutionary perspective, why would that be associated with so much stress? Why would it matter to me if you accept me? Why would it matter to you if I accept you? Looking at it from this idea of an evolutionary perspective or a biological perspective, which is to say, natural selection favors your passing your genes on to the next generation if you stay connected socially. Why would that be the case? Do you have any thoughts about that? Why are we social beings? Why does it matter if you accept me or not?
Well, through the lens of
that
lens, that's really the determining factor of whether you proceed into the next generation. So you have to put on a mask, pretty much, or not put on a mask, but be yourself for the most part. But I think it's very difficult to be yourself, for the social acceptance part of it.
You're actually prefiguring an image that I have at the very end of our presentation that shows a woman pulling a mask off. And I think there's truth in what you're saying, is that I think of it this way around addiction, and it ties back to what you were saying earlier around shame, is that people will say, how can somebody be so evil as to do what they do when they're addicted? And my own view is that people, first of all, do evil things when they're addicted, and they do them as a function of what addiction does to the brain. And I'm coming from a psychological perspective for sure, but I have no doubt about that. And so the idea that I would take off any kind of social concern for you, any kind of moral scruples, I'm going to say take off that mask so you can see the real me. And people will say, well, it doesn't, and I've heard people say this, doesn't addiction show the real Odie or the real Bob? And I would say this, no, actually what it shows is it shows what happens if you take away Odie's frontal cortex, or if you take away Bob's frontal cortex. So what you have is you have midbrain, which is a very primitive part of the brain that's really governed by fight, flight, or freeze. And it will take whatever it wants. It's completely egocentric. I don't think of that as being the real Odie. I don't think that's being the real Bob, because you have all these other parts. And so I think what you were talking about is mask right now. We have multiple layers, and we'll look at this image later. If you take off one of these layers, like addiction does to us, you'll end up with somebody that's a distortion of who you are. And you know that personally, and I certainly know it as a function of addiction. But I would hesitate to say that's the real Odie or the real Bob. And so we live in a social context, which is the social contract, is you're not going to do that stuff. I'm going to be able to count on you, be able to trust you, be able to rely on you. Among other things, there's strength in numbers. If Odie and Bob hang together on the prairie, we have a better chance of surviving than if we're separated. So from just purely a biological perspective, it'd be do well for us to accept each other. That is to be friends, to get along. It would be good for us to do that. And if you treat me poorly or I treat you poorly, we jeopardize that. And in the process, we jeopardize both of our survivals. And so this threat to social acceptance is tied right into the deepest survival. And you said it right, is that it's not only our survival right now, it's the survival of our genes to the next generation. And this even ties into sex and reproduction, is that if we're not able to be accepted by others, including a partner that would help us create a new child, passing our genes to the next generation, then we're in big trouble, big trouble. So if the threat to social acceptance is one part of this, and we're looking at that from a biological perspective, let's look at a threat to our self-esteem, which is, as we're saying, is kind of the second column or the second point of shame here. Mm-hmm. How would a threat to self-esteem be related to our biological survival? Any thoughts about that? Who cares if you feel good about yourself, Odie or Bob?
I care.
Yeah, you care. And why do we care? Why do you think we care? Why does it matter from a biological perspective? Why might it matter that we feel effective in our lives? Why would that matter?
Well, I think the first thing that came to mind with that is just I thought first and foremost of, well, if I'm not feeling confident or high self-esteem in myself, then I'm not going to be able to attract either a mate or really be able to, and even be able to provide for myself. If I'm talking like career, we're talking in a career-wise sense, be able to provide food, shelter, clothing, and whatnot.
I think you're right on the right track. In fact, the way I look at this is that we're talking about two sides of the coin, and so it's really hard to separate them, is that we talked a minute ago about threats to social acceptance. If you don't accept me, then I'm alone, and that makes me more at risk for survival. And now we're talking about threats to self-esteem. If I don't feel good, if I don't feel effective in my own life, are you going to want to hang out with me?
No.
Probably not. And am I going to be attracted to a partner with whom I might reproduce to the next generation? Probably not either. Not, yeah. And so it gets very hard to say which comes first, because they're really both related. In fact, the way that I think about this is that you can get trapped in a vicious cycle here. This image, there's an image right here, Austin, of being trapped in a vicious cycle around shame, is that it doesn't matter whether it starts off that if we go back to your example of the turtle in the shell, if you reject me, then I'll have that turtle in the shell experience. And then if I go away and, like you said, begin to believe what you said about me, that is, begin to doubt myself, now my self-esteem is lowered. And when I come back, if the turtle comes back and says, will you be my friend? Well, now I'm a turtle that self-doubts itself, probably less attractive to you. In fact, more likely to be judged by you, because now you're calling me a turtle. And so I go away, and that's the vicious cycle, is that a loss to self-esteem breeds a threat to social acceptance. A threat to social acceptance breeds a loss to self-esteem, and so there it goes. And so we're caught in that cycle. What I want to do now is I want to do an exercise, and I want to encourage our viewers to join us in this, and you're welcome to journal. And if you're viewing this after the fact, if you're viewing this in its archived form, then you can just stop the recording and spend a few minutes with this. Odie and I are going to share, God willing, as we go through this exercise. But want to give you time to do that, and encourage you, if you're watching live today, after our show today, to just reflect a bit in your own journaling. It'll help deepen the material. In fact, I'm going to finish up today to talk about how and why it's valuable for us to write things down and talk the way that we're talking. So the journal exercise is this. I'm going to guide us through it. The first piece we're going to look at is a threat to social acceptance. And so what I want to ask us to do is to think of a time, Odie, I'll think of a time as well, a time where that's been imperiled, where my social connection has been jeopardized. And so to locate that to begin with, to think of an example that you'd be willing to share, I've been thinking about this, and there's one I'm willing to share. Do you have something? Okay. What I want to do is I'll talk through it, and this will be a model for what you can do on your own at home, okay? It's very simple. I just want to look at what happened, summarize what happened, and then how did it feel? We're going to look at those two things. What happened and how did it feel? And so if you can just summarize briefly what happened and how it felt to you, that'll give us a start. And then we're going to take it deeper. Okay?
Okay, I'll try to summarize it.
Okay. Yeah.
I think it was sixth or fifth grade. There was this girl in my class that I liked. And I told somebody that I wasn't really friends with, a guy, but really wasn't friends with. I shared with him, I opened up to him and said, hey, thinking about asking this girl to, and there was this thing that was going on like a week. In a week, it was like, I think it was called the Hold Down, where people go down to like the gym area, they turn on music, and you just dance or just hang out, whatever. And so I told him, I was like, I'm thinking about asking this girl to the hoedown. And so she just happened, while I was telling him this, she just happened to be passing out papers to everybody. And she was right next to us. And he just thought it was a good idea to be like, hey, he wants to ask you out to the hoedown. And so immediately I got red, and I didn't know what to expect of her reaction. She just went, and then she walked away. So that was, and
who of us doesn't have a version of that experience? Oh man!
The way that felt was embarrassing. Very embarrassing.
Yeah.
So
that feeling, and you said it's just like you turn red.
Yeah.
It's a whole embodied response, isn't it? Yeah. Bad friend. Bad friend. Bad friend. Well, let's do this. Let's just stay with it for just a second.
Okay.
Let me ask you, if we take it one step further, if we take it a little bit deeper, how did it affect you, not only in terms of how you felt, because you shared that with us, but how you felt about yourself, and maybe in the aftermath of it? I'd just be curious, any memories you have of this? I know it's a long time ago, but it also feels fresh. So
yeah. To take it deeper, like you mentioned, at the time, I think I had just gotten back. I've gone back into school, because before then I was actually out of school for like a year because of what happened physically to me. I had an operation on my hip, so I was out of school for like a year. So, and then I had gained weight as well. So like all this stuff just started coming like after that, and thinking about it even now, just how it wasn't just that situation that affected me. It was throughout that time, of just feeling like, well, it's funny now, but just thinking like, well, of course she said she had that reaction because I wasn't good looking at the time, was the thought.
My mind went ahead for a second, so I want to ask you, did you have the operation before or after? You just said it, but I missed it because mine was
before.
You had the operation before, okay, and you'd also put on some weight. I think you said before, okay. So it's all kind of, this is the way that it goes. I love the way you're describing this. The way it goes, all these things kind of conspire together to affect how you feel about yourself.
Yeah.
And if there's a word or two that you could summarize for how you felt about yourself during that, let's say that period of time, anything come to mind?
I'd have to say probably unattractive, I think would be the best to explain it. Just because, it was the attraction that I felt for her, and just hoping, hopefully she's attracted to me. But and then just having that reaction, it's like, well, maybe I'm not attractive.
Even your choice of that word, unattractive, when we think about what we've talked about, that shame is a social emotion. It's tied into your accepting me and my accepting you. In this case, that girl accepting you, that girl finding you attractive. Think about that. That serves even, how old were you? You say 5th or 6th grade maybe? Something
probably like 10, 11, something like that.
So even at that age, we're hardwired for that stuff to matter. And so to feel unattractive, to feel like that I may not be accepted by this girl, in this case for you, is to go right to the heart of that. And it does affect how we feel about ourselves. And so that term, unattractive, has a social connotation, as well as a turtle connotation, in a sense of wanting to crawl under the turtle shell, for sure.
Right.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And it happened at a relatively young age for you. I want to share an example briefly that happened at a much older age, and I think that there's a tie-in between the two experiences. I got addicted to alcohol and then other drugs in midlife, which is, I've shared before here openly. It's statistically unusual. I mentioned here in our podcast that I work a lot with young men and women who are in early recovery from addiction. That's more typically the course. Oftentimes, I think if there's a modal experience of those I work with, many of them started using when they were 12 or 13 or 14, not much older than you were at this age, begin using. And by the time that they reach latter adolescence and early adulthood, they've got an active addiction going on. So that's more typical. So my story is atypical, and because it's more recent, I can access it also with a fair bit of ease. Is that for me to come to the place where I was clear with myself that I was addicted and that I needed help was a hugely shameful experience for me.
Yeah.
And I've been thinking about it in preparation for today's podcast. It's ironic is it was shameful in terms of social acceptance from two directions. The first direction is more obvious, is that for Bob to come out with being addicted and needing help and needing to get into recovery means that if you're not addicted, you might judge me. It's like, oh, that Bob, he does stuff, don't know about him, that kind of thing. But there's another side that may be less obvious, is that not only might I be judged by those that weren't using or addicted, I was also judged by those that were. So these would be my so-called drinking buddies, etc.
Right.
Is that they just lost their drinking buddy.
Right.
They just lost their friend. And so they're not standing up and going, hey, that's great, Bob, that you've acknowledged that you've got an addiction problem. And honestly, also to really own this, is that there was a sense of failure because I had friends that were able to so-called party that didn't seem like it got the best of them, and I got swamped by addiction. And so there was a way that I failed. I failed as a partier.
Right.
And then for people that don't party, I failed because I ever did party, and I partied to extremes. So, for me, there was very much, from all angles, kind of across the board, a threat to social acceptance. Which is not to say that everybody rejected me, but I fear that everybody did. And then this gets back to what you shared earlier in terms of the turtle. I actually did get judged and rejected, and I experienced significant loss as a function of my addiction. But it wasn't across the board. But it didn't matter because I got to where I thought everybody was judging me that way. And then the worst of it is I started judging myself that way. Do you remember how you talked about this?
Yeah.
Is that now that you buy it, that what people say that this is who Odie is,
Right.
I got to, this is who Bob is.
Yeah.
And everybody could leave, and I would judge myself that way. This is who I am to myself.
Yeah.
That was the worst of it for me. And so it moved from addiction to feeling embarrassed or ashamed of that in public, to feeling judgment, then to internalizing that. And it led then, this is where you get this full circle, this kind of this vicious cycle. It led to loss of social acceptance, to feeling awful about myself. And the truth is it was reinforcing because now I was depressed. I was depressed and I was in early recovery. So I was experiencing those early symptoms of recovery, which are not pleasant for anybody.
Right.
And didn't make me fun to be around, made me unattractive, to use your word, deeply unattractive. And so this story that I'm sharing is in that way not unrelated to yours. In fact, there's a way
that
you were 10 or 11 or 12. You're not so young. I mean, it sounds crazy to say this. You're not so young that if you'd been exposed to pot, let's say, if you'd had friends that could turn you on to smoking weed, and I've had clients who had family members that said, here, just have a little shot of this alcohol. If you could have had that and experienced relief from this feeling, that could have been one of those pivot points for you in your life. So the fact is that these unpleasant feelings, if we can find a way to self-medicate, virtually at any age we may do it. Certainly by the time that we're in adolescence and we're much more vulnerable to peer pressure, to people saying, here, smoke this, drink this, then we can be well on our way to this self-medicating that starts off benignly. I feel so much better. I don't feel so bad about the girl saying whatever she did because now I'm a little bit buzzed. But then when that becomes like habitual, in fact, anytime I'm not buzzed, I don't feel good about myself. Anytime I'm not altered, I don't feel attractive. That's one of the places that addiction can sink in its talons. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I had a question that came to mind while you were speaking, because you brought up self-medicating. And I guess the question would be, is it possible to self-medicate oneself with what's the best way to say this? Negative talk, self-talk, negative self-talk, I guess would be the best way. Is there a way that somebody that can use that to self-medicate for a certain situation?
I think so. Let me see if this helps to answer it. I'll come in an indirect way. Is that it doesn't look like this, but some people use rage as a way to to self-regulate, to keep things on a balance, is that how I feel good is I'm angry at you and I'm yelling at you now, and it actually makes me feel superior to you because after all I'm putting you down. I'm yelling louder than you, etc. And so people can use a negative emotion to feel better about themselves. And to your point, which is feeling bad about myself, the first thought that comes to my mind, and some of our viewers may have other thoughts and you may have other thoughts here too, is that there can be kind of a strange or paradoxical comfort in what's familiar. So if I'm used to being unattractive, I can actually find some peace of mind in it kind of being the status quo, business as usual. And the way that reveals itself is if you come up to me and say, Bob, you're not unattractive, you are attractive, that can actually feel unpleasant. And it reveals then that I'm actually more at home with feeling unattractive. And so if you name me as attractive, that can bring up all kinds of possible discomfort for me. For example, well, you find I'm attractive now, but what if you saw me this morning? Or what if I lost that? Or maybe you don't care anything else about me, but that if I'm attractive, you can go down a list of things that could make a compliment actually be risky business. And I can find security in feeling bad about myself. And I've heard people talk about this way. Sometimes our negative self-talk actually can nurture us. Can nurture us. It can nourish and nurture us. So is that along the idea of what you're asking?
Yeah, that's actually right on the dot. So thank you. Another question that came to mind. How about, because I've had relatives that used to do this. So after a long day of work, they'd come home, and their way of relaxing would be to crack open a can of their favorite beer.
Right.
Would that be a way of self-medicating as well?
Yeah, it's a good question. People have different opinions. I do not demonize drinking your favorite beer. I don't. And there'll be plenty of people, including in the recovery field, that might do that. For me, in fact, it brings up the question: then what constitutes a problem? And from our conversations that I actually prefer using the word. It's not even used these days as much in psychiatry and psychology. I prefer using the word addiction because I think if I pop open the beer and it's a way to relax, how is that different than me watching a TV show, or in my case, picking up a pair of drumsticks and playing? Probably not. I don't assume that it is. The problem enters in is that when I cannot stop that, which is to say when I become enslaved to it, and as we've talked about here, enslavement is just that's the root word of addiction. Addictus in Latin means slave. And so I can become enslaved to drumming. I can become enslaved to TV. I can become enslaved to popping open a can of beer. And so I don't assume that it's negative. And so if we use self-medicate, I'll tell you a distinction I prefer to that. Because I would prefer using the term self-medicate to use it in the context of addiction, but I get where you're going with it. I prefer to think about this in terms of one author referred to as a positive addiction. There are things I really like doing. They make me feel good. I'm hesitant. For example, people will say I'm addicted to chocolate. If you like chocolate and you eat chocolate within reason, I can understand why you'd say that. And I'd probably say that we'd laugh together. But I don't technically believe you're addicted to chocolate. Now, if you are going through one bar of chocolate after another and can't stop, and you're doing that at the expense of your health and regulating your emotions because you're sugar, et cetera, like that, then we can talk about addiction. Then we can talk about self-medication. But I don't assume that in terms of general discourse, that would involve self-medication. It does bring up a memory for me, and I'll share it. Years ago, I had a student at another university I was working at who wanted to write a paper on the recreational use of heroin. And you like the look in your face.
I was like, that's a thing?
Yeah, that is a thing. That is a thing. And she was talking about the non-addictive recreational use of heroin. She referred in her paper to chipping was the idea, where you just take a little heroin just to kind of like take the edge off. And that would be a more controversial stance, okay? and I could go more technically into this just to suggest that the difference between chocolate and heroin is major.
Yeah, that's pretty.
Can we just say that? In terms of the way that it affects one's brain, let's not even talk about dopamine levels. Austin over here is going, I don't know, it's weighing it like that. So let's put it this way. If my normal dopamine level is at a 1, which means right now just being alert and being in this conversation, which we're enjoying, we're at a 1.
Right.
The research that's been done, in fact, has been done up the way in UCLA, is that something as powerful as sexual orgasm doubles that to a level of 2. And you can reference your own experience. That's a very powerful doubling of that. And they're looking just strictly at the dopamine release in the brain, which is associated with the experience of reward or pleasure, is that chocolate's probably somewhere in the zone of 1.5, and I'm being very generous to chocolate, okay? You introduce heroin into it, it's 10 times the amount of dopamine as our resting level. There's no comparison between chocolate in that case and heroin. And so the idea of let's have a little chunk of chocolate, let's have a little chunk of heroin would be extremely hard to defend, it seems like to me, from a just pure brain science kind of perspective. Okay. Yeah, so good questions. I love your questions. There's a question or a comment that's come in. This person's agreeing with Odie. Negative self-talk is less painful to me than someone else judging me. Very good observation. Thank you. That's a piece that I missed. I really like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I can remember as a boy, I would preempt other people judging me by doing that myself first. I can still remember that was a conscious strategy for me, and I did it with my guy friends. It's not something I announced because it would not be something you would announce, but I can remember that I would be willing to kind of fall on my own sword, so to speak, so as to avoid you criticizing me. I would do that myself. And this is on the continuum with that, where that's another way that I can be in charge of negative self-talk. And as I'm saying in my own case, I can also possibly preempt your criticism by doing that. We used to have this saying on the playground: you don't hit somebody who's down. There's a few people you don't hit. You don't hit somebody who's down. We used to say you don't hit somebody with glasses. That was one of the rules. And you don't hit a girl.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, in my case, I took it as you don't hit somebody who's down. If I've already kind of showed my vulnerability by saying criticizing myself, then it's a violation of code for you to come after me. And so, yeah. Guys, we're going to wrap up for today. And I promised this image, and it's tied into something that Odie shared earlier. The image is, we've been talking about the two faces of shame: threats to social acceptance on the one hand, threats to self-esteem, and how they're inseparable from one another. And this image reminds me of the image you talked about, is that there's who we are, and then we take that mask off, that there's two faces of shame, and that there's the public side of shame. The face gets red. Yeah. There's the private side, and we've already talked about it. Shame is a very isolating emotion. Even though it's a social emotion, it's so painful that we want to isolate. And your image of the turtle, I felt like, was really important. Let me wrap up by saying this. There is hope. And you may want, well, how is there hope in hearing these awful stories that Bob and Odie are sharing? And I want to say this just by way of closing today, is that one of the things I feel very strongly about is that hope starts by being able to name our experience. And so that the way that this last individual was able to name the fact that negative self-talk is actually less onerous than having somebody criticize this person, that's naming it. And by our ability to give words to something, we're halfway to a new place. And I'll say what I mean by that in terms of the brain, is that shame is really rooted in the emotional center of the brain, which is located between our ears, and it's very much connected to a fight, flight, or freeze reaction. And those kind of survival-based reactions are really, they originate in the center of our brain, what's referred to as the midbrain. And for example, shame is oftentimes understood as a freeze reaction. The turtle. It just freezes. Okay. That's a different reaction than going after somebody aggressively with anger or running away from somebody with fright. It's a third reaction. It really deserves its own, and it does. It's a freeze reaction. And so if we understand shame as being a midbrain phenomenon, anything that we can do to bring conscious awareness and language to talking about this experience. Remember how we started?
Mm-hmm.
It's very hard to talk about shame or how to define it.
Yeah.
And yet, look at what we've done. You've remembered examples of it. We've talked about it. We've unpacked it. We've defined it. We've analyzed it, sliced it this way and that way, and so on. That doesn't do away with shame, but what that does is that gives us tools to deal with shame. And so if we can move shame from being a midbrain phenomenon to being available to the executive function of the brain, which is located primarily in the frontal cortex, then we're doing something important. And it's perfectly analogous to what happens in addiction, in active addiction. If you're addicted to behaviors, if you're addicted to substances, by definition, addiction is what's referred to as a hypofrontal phenomenon. Hypofrontality is this. Hypo means underneath. Hypodermis is underneath your skin. Hypofrontal means underneath your frontal lobes. And so what happens in active addiction, if you hook up my brain and your brain in any kind of addictive behavior, they will look very similar. Doesn't matter what the behavior is and how they'll look similar, is the frontal cortex, which is the executive part of our brain that makes decisions, weighs consequences, acts morally, cares about others. All of that stuff is a function of the frontal cortex, and in active addiction, the frontal cortex goes dark. If you do a brain scan, it's dark. What's lit up is the center of the brain, which are the addiction, the pleasure centers, the reward circuitry of the brain is all in the midbrain. And so I think not only does our talking about this involve a major step forward in terms of addressing shame, it's also exactly what needs to be happen if we're going to really successfully recover. So you have to find words for our experiences and then tie our behaviors into those clear concepts. And so I do feel like there's hope, and even though we've talked about some painful experiences today for sure, it begins to give us a shared vocabulary, and that's really my wish for this series moving forward. Odie and I will be sharing each week, commenting together on various aspects of addiction and recovery, talking about psychological phenomena centering around shame as a metaphor for the most stressful experiences that we have that are intimately related to addiction. And as we begin to refine and expand that vocabulary, it gives us strength. One author puts it this way, is that good ideas are psychoactive. They actually change our lives. Good thinking. I think of shame as being paralyzing. It paralyzes our thoughts. When you're in that turtle place, you're like a deer in the headlights, not to mix metaphors, but we are.
Turtle in the headlights.
There's nothing worse than being a turtle in the headlights, and we all know that experience. So anything that we can do to move back into gaining some control over that, and I think good information, it can actually free us up from the paralyzed turtle in the headlights. And so that's where we're aiming. In that spirit, next week's podcast will be addressing two other concepts, and we'll be comparing them together and going deep into them. We'll be looking at shame versus guilt next week, and clear definitions here will be very helpful to us as we continue to expand forward. We'll have a guest in our session next week. Occasionally we bring in guests, and I'll be dialoguing with Bruce, who'll be joining us next week. So I hope you'll come back then, okay? If you have any final questions, feel free to write me. Austin's going to bring up my website address, and you can email me from that website address, just drbobweathers.com. You can also reach out to Austin directly through the Facebook group or through YouTube. If you have any questions for Odie and me, feel free to write those. I want to thank you for your participation today. I wish you safe travels through this week all, and we'll see you next week. Take care. Bye-bye for now.